Okay. We're here today to have a conversation about journalism. And when I look in the room, I see it's kind of a mix of students and old pros and people interested in politics. So I'm sure you'll have some really compelling questions, and that's what we're here to answer, not to lecture, because we don't lecture. But we're also here to celebrate Gene's career. It was George's idea that we would have a forum where you could talk to Gene about his more than 45, right?
45 on the dot.
45 on the dot. Years in local journalism. And, that goes back to the days of print only and television news. And radio was a power then, too. No internet, no cable. People got their news on the doorstep in the morning, pretty much, if they didn't get it at 11 o'clock. And Gene has seen all of that unfold in San Diego, probably longer than anybody but Bob Witte, who hired Gene at your second iteration, right? You had worked at the Independent?
Correct. And in 1973, I began 4 years with Bob and the company.
Yeah. And then Rory Devine, who I told George said, I want to have Gene, but I also want to have 100 years of experience. So, no, I don't. No, Rory, that's the. So I said, well, Gene's got 45, so you can have Gene, but you can't have 100 unless you have the two of us. Because Rory, between us all, we have actually 130 years, I would say. Because Rory, you started, what was your first year? And where did you work? TV, right? The whole time?
I started in San Luis Obispo.
San Luis Obispo.
Okay? San Luis Obispo.
No, Rory and Gene, come on up. Because we're not going to talk one at a time. We're all going to be here to talk to you. So I thought this was actually
This on camera?
I thought it was a camera,
Oh
but
my God.
it's a microphone. Yeah,
Where's the
George, you
teleprompter?
didn't say that every one of your sessions is on YouTube.
Yep.
And most of them get millions of views. I'm sure this will get in the tens of millions. But anyway, between the three of us, we have...
Among
among the three
say
of us.
that, but I didn't.
She's a school teacher formerly.
We have more than 100 years of experience, and can you believe it? Locally, we all work locally for most of our career. And Rory, would you like to say anything?
I was going to say that, which you told me to say, on the way in the car, he told me to say, the only reason that I'm here is for 100 years experience. I don't know why that keeps resonating with folks.
Your line,
You did steal my line. Yeah. But it is a beautiful day. Fortunately, I'm able to look out and see it. I can just keep you apprised of what it looks like. It is gorgeous. And I'm so grateful that the students are here. You all from Point Loma? Yep. Thank you for being here. We're going to encourage you-ish.
Yeah, or discourage you-ish. I wanted to start by, I was curious if the attributes that made a good reporter 45 years ago still make a good reporter today. And I was going to ask Bob Witte, who hired Gene in 1973, to tell us in a couple of sentences, what were the attributes? You could have hired a lot of people to work for you at the Daily Transcript. What was it about Gene that made him someone you wanted on your staff?
He was available.
I needed the money.
Wow.
To get a steady little bit. This was the Daily Transcript, which is a paper that was 100 years old, but it never had a staff. There were no reporters. And so I was hired as editor, and Keith Lister bought the paper, and we aimed it to be a sort of mini Wall Street Journal, covering financial and business news. and City Hall, county, and all that. So I was looking for reporters, and Gene was one of the first people who came from the Independent, and he was very smart, obviously, and we had a good interview, had good clips, and one thing he had too was a degree from Stanford. And all the time I was working at the Union Tribune, I think, interviewing clients, I don't think I ever had one from Stanford. I don't know why, but Anyway, that was an added addition to it, another thing that Ben Bradley told me once about interviewing, hiring new people, is he said one of the first things he looked for was energy. And Gene had a lot of energy, and he proved it for the years after that.
Good, thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob. And you hired a number of reporters that I was just happy to be among.
Yes, that was
Is
her.
Karen here today? I did not see her.
She was planning to be here. I saw her yesterday, but I have not seen her today.
Okay.
But she was also, and Denise, hiring Denise, I called Jim Jewin, who was dean of the School of Journalism at San Jose State, and said, Jim, who's your top student graduating this year? And it was Denise. So.
Thank you, Bob. So let's just open up to questions. We could fill the whole half hour ourselves, but what are you guys thinking about what's going on in the world of journalism? And what do you want to know about the way things are covered in this town, or what you see on cable TV every day, or students, questions you might have about what your future is in this business, and how to do a better job at it? Yeah.
Well, salaries have certainly changed over the years. So what do you tell, salaries have changed obviously, downwardly.
Yes.
What do you tell young students coming out, it's not about the money, right? It's,
I thought about that on the way out.
Paul, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Oh, the question was that journalism doesn't pay anymore. I mean, politely. He said salaries.
it wasn't used to.
Yeah. Well, journalism was never a profession that people got into for money. Yeah, in television, there's, what is that? 5%. That's a tiny percent when you look at the universe of journalism. Journalism was always a job that didn't pay well. TV news, you could definitely make a good living, but most yeoman print journalism was a median salary. When I first started, I remember in 1975, reporters at the Union Tribune were making $334 a week. That was like the union scale. You could buy a house in San Diego on that salary at that time, but it certainly wasn't. It certainly wasn't a lot of money. And yes, pay is way down in television, in print, and everything. And I just want to say, I don't know how people still go into it, because I don't think the money's enough to live on. And my son, who's a very smart kid and a brilliant writer, when he was like 16 or 15, I said, William, if it was 30 years ago, I would tell you to be a journalist, but I can't tell you to do that now, because I don't think that you can make a living doing it. And I think it's a big problem. And I see it every day at our station, because despite the fact that we're owned by this multi-billion-dollar corporation, Comcast, we don't pay the kind of salaries for entry-level journalists that will get people with the minimal experience that they need. And I think it's a big issue. And I don't see it getting any better. What do you guys think?
Comcast, NBC, Universal, you're right. They trimmed the scale, and I thought at one point I could talk with my boys. By the way, welcome this morning, all students, graduates, and my son Jeff, who is a graduate of UCLA. And they kind of looked at me like, nah, that doesn't interest me, getting into print or broadcast. We've got other things that are going to tempt our interest there. But you're right, it's not the money-making machine that it used to be. Now, when you get up to the upper ranks of anchoring and the executive levels, oh yeah. But otherwise, it's hard to crash in about the level that I did, certainly at the Independent, and then the Daily Transcript. Thanks, Bob. You were a step up from the Independent, and the Union, long before it merged with the Tribune, was a step up, but not a great step up when I think about the numbers you're giving me back when I got to the Union in 1977. I was there for 2 years before I went over to Channel 8, and that still was nothing to speak of. I'm speaking of it now, but it was not it was not terrific.
Yeah, Rory, what are your thoughts? You know what a big, yeah. I mean, salaries are going down.
Yeah.
You know,
Even cost of living, we don't get. Really.
Yeah. I mean, I think that generally television talent in local markets is being paid considerably less than it was 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah. It's a complicated issue because I wanted to say to the students here, I was a little worried because I was afraid you were going to say, what can I do in journalism? And I was thinking the same thing. Well, I'm not sure that I would tell my daughter to get into journalism because the pay is just not there. I do disagree with you, however. I think that years ago, at least when I was getting into the business, I obviously love what I do and I wanted to do good in the world, but I also was interested in making money. So I was a school teacher before this, and I wanted to make some money, so I got into journalism. Yeah, right. And San Diego used to be a hard market to get into. At that time, there were 3 television stations: ABC, CBS, and NBC. So it was hard. You had to have some experience, and the entry level salaries were not that bad. And then you would go up. But then, as we all know, we have many more stations, and so we have less money, and so we have less pay. And the pay, I think you said you were worried about it. I'm worried about it too because I think that good people aren't going to go into it, and those who are there aren't going to stay in it. And I do add this one other thing, and I don't know if I'm right or I'm wrong, and I certainly would love to have feedback, but sometimes I think that as soon as women go into a field, and there's a lot of women in this field, the pay goes down. We have psychologists. Now all of a sudden we have more women in psychology, and now the pay goes down. What is that? Is it because men to say, oh, I'm not going to go into that because it doesn't pay. I'm going to go into finance or whatever because that pays more. And I know I'm not trying to be a victim up here because I'm a woman, but sometimes I do wonder about what happens to those professions that become female-dominated. Peggy?
You're saying the female salaries drag the male salaries?
No, I say that we have more females. Well, maybe. I think we have more females going into the journalism because they want to do good in the world, I guess, and don't worry about salaries as much.
Those numbers have grown. That's
right,
true.
those numbers have grown. It's just sort of a thing out there.
That's
Peggy.
interesting. I don't agree
Peggy.
with that because
I don't
think
know if
the
I
reason
agree with it either.
the reason salaries are down.
I just
Just
put it
saying
out
it.
there.
The reason salaries are down in journalism is because the advertising model's broken. Every year, this year for the first time, the percentage of ads that are online versus in traditional exceeded 50%. And it's just going to keep growing. And you cannot make money off the internet, off putting your newspaper on the internet like you make it when you print it. So the reason salaries are down is because the revenue is down, and because the companies that own the properties are still going to make a profit. So where are they going to make their profit? They're going to make their profit on lower salaries. And also, and I do understand what you're saying, my wife, like your husband, is in mental health, and I think what's happened in mental health is that it's always the orphan. It has always been the orphan profession. We devalue mental health as opposed to other kinds of medical treatment. And
But more women are going
Yes.
to be psychologists. More women are
Yes.
going to be
No, that's
journalists.
true.
It's like all of a sudden,
Yeah.
I don't know. Do we not care how much money we make? I don't know, because
No.
it just seems that women go into these fields, and then I'm not saying the salaries are. We bring the salaries down. I just think women are They go into the fields that aren't getting paid.
Mhm.
Oh,
Mike?
I don't know.
As you know, I'm always reluctant to add my voice to But I just want to tell you that from my perspective, as I came out of Berkeley Law School, I was all about social change. And Brandeis invented the model of putting the sunlight on the difficult questions. The thing that was unique about Gene is he was willing to go out and do the really hard stories that made everybody call down to the station and complain. And that type of information is so critical to make the democracy work. Abraham Lincoln public opinion, you can do everything. Without public opinion, you can do nothing. And I think what has happened, to some degree, because I agree with your overall comments, is that because there's so much misinformation put out, so much manipulated information put out, that a lot of people just don't know how to distinguish what is real from what is fake. So I would say it's even more important now for these young journalists. Money aside, it's even more important for you to study the career of this man, Gene Cubbison, and model yourself after that. Money will take care of itself. Okay? It will take care of itself. But our democracy is in deep trouble right now. And we need the young people to come in and to reestablish it. And what happens? It ebbs and it flows. You have your times of the muckrakers and Krueger magazine and all of that. And then, and the Watergate, and then it slides back. But I think right now, the journalism right now is doing stellar work. Stellar work. CNN and all the major stellar work to deal with this really threatening fake news, manipulation of
Those are
I want to
wonderful.
congratulate Gene because I say that means to say that we had a lot of stories together.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I got him in a lot of trouble.
Thank you, Mike. Those are some excellent comments.
I want to add
Yeah.
about journalism, what it's doing, because I can speak with more than a little experience about the New York Times and the Washington Post. I think the reporting they're doing today is the greatest ever in its history. And it's probably more important than it's ever been. They're just setting an incredible standard. And the president may call it fake news. It's not fake news. They're just doing a great job for all of us, seriously.
Yeah, I want to make two comments before we call on the questions. The first is, I agree. I want to temper what I said, about when I tell young people, think twice about going into this career where you won't be able to have a family. Mike is absolutely right about, you have to think about money will take care of itself. And number two, people who have the drive, if you want, I remember when I was 21 and I wrote my first story for an alternative weekly in Santa Cruz, and I saw it in print like you would see it online, and I was like, this is all I want to do with my life. See, I think it doesn't matter what I say, because I believe that if you want to be a journalist and you have the calling to do it, you're going to do it. And you're going to say, I'll find a way to make it go. And I agree with that. Number two, about the New York Times and about this broken model and the lack of revenue. That is an example of how good journalism pays. I mean, the New York Times is making huge amounts of money off the internet. People are subscribing $7 a month, and their readership is up by millions, and they're making good money because they're making a good product in a time that counts. So, that's a heartening aspect of it. But you have a question?
Yes, to follow up on misinformation, fake news, what's the best journalist style or way to deal with fake news and misinformation and when someone is lying? How do you cover that?
Can you repeat it?
Oh, she said, what as journalists, if I understand correctly, if you're a journalist and you're covering a story and you know that somebody is telling you something that's not true, how do you incorporate that, challenge that in your story?
You continue to hammer on it, and you continue to go after the, let's say, fake politicians, the fake whomevers that are saying, this is the truth, that's the truth. And you just continue to expose what you know to be true, guaranteed by the evidence that's there, guaranteed by the sources who are telling you this is what's happening, that is not what's happening. You just have to stand and fight. Like I say, you can't go, oh no, don't say that. It's true. It's true. And eventually the truth wins out. The truth wins out. And those who are lying right now, those who are making false promises, false statements, they're going to be caught up with. It's very hard to fight the liars, to put it that way. Misinformation, but you have to continue to fight. It's going to be a constant battle, and you must continue to fight it. You can't just suddenly go into a hole and say, "Shh, we better shush with that for a while."
Rory, what do you have some thoughts?
I did.
Well, while she's thinking, I'll say one thing.
I was still listening to what you said. But about the fake news, two things.
Yeah.
I just remembered. I think that not necessarily this audience, because I think we all know, but I feel like when I'm out in the world, people, the whole fake news thing is because they're watching cable news, which is, they have a right to, say what their perspective is. If it's MSNBC, it's going to be more liberal. If it's CNN, it's going to be more liberal. If it's Fox, it's going to be more conservative. And I don't think people understand the differentiation. I've had to explain that to people so many times, it surprises me that they say, well, there's too much opinion. I'm like, well, what are you watching? So I think there's that. And then with regard to fake news, I will say that two things are happening, I think, as journalists out there. One is, you're sitting there or you're standing there ready to do a live shot and people drive by, go, fake news. Okay, that's happening. And when you're at a party, people, fake news, whatever. But the other side, I think, that is also happening is that people have said to me, and I've been standing there as well, people saying it must be really hard to be a journalist. Just keep doing what you're doing. So that I also feel like a sense of more prideful than I ever have when I watched that movie. Help me out. Thank you. I just need people to follow me around and fill in my blanks. When I watched that movie, The Post, and people clapped at the end, it was so, I just felt so great. So there's two things that are going on. One is the fake news. The other is the people that really appreciate what's happening.
Yeah, and I would say one thing you're seeing is in papers like the New York Times and maybe some other reputable publications.
The Post, some of the magazines.
They will just call out the lies or the inaccuracies. Say, when Trump talks about the number of people that have crossed the border illegally, that's not fake news. That's just inaccurate, or to be pejorative, it's a lie, because there's a fact. It's not an opinion issue. It's really a fact. And I think what journalism has to do is just relentlessly tell the truth. Relentlessly tell the facts. And
Paul, can I say one thing
Yeah.
to that? I also think what's going on is there's a lot of bullying now. We talk about relentlessly telling the truth, relentlessly getting the facts, don't give up. I feel, and Mark and Jeff, I think, that have been with me when I've been, I feel that they feel like some people, I don't want to mention school districts, okay. I feel like they don't feel like they need to tell us things. And that wasn't happening before. We would call, we'd ask a question, they would answer. I see some nods over there. Now it's sort of like, we'll tell you when we want to tell you, if we want to tell you, and oh, by the way, there's a spaghetti dinner that's happening on Thursday night. So, and they feel like they can bully us. And I have had more trouble now than I've ever had before. And I was like, somebody said to me, a PIO said, you've changed. I said, I don't think I've changed. I think you're under a lot of pressure. And I realized, I went to my boss and he said, it's the bullying of the media, the permission, and you know what I'm talking about, the permission to say fake news, the permission to bully. I think that's also a change.
Well,
I'm gonna
and also, this is an economic issue. What Rory's talking about is this problem that we have that we've never had before, which is the inability to get information from institutions. Right. And why is that? Well, number one is the advent of email. People don't talk on the phone anymore.
Right.
Everybody wants to send you a comment. So when they send you a comment, and that's the extent of what you're going to get, it's crafted and it's damage control, and it generally doesn't answer your question. Back in the day, when the way you did stories was you phoned somebody and you talked to them on the phone, or you went and saw them and you talked to somebody face to face or on the phone, you could get generally an answer to the question. But when you have a dialogue through email, you're not going to get it. That's a big problem. Number two, the institutions know that the staffs at the TV stations and the newspapers are small. They know we don't have the time or the personnel to fight the battles. They know that if they just don't answer us, generally we'll move on to the next story. There are some exceptions, but if I was advising a client, I would often say, ignore it, don't answer it, it'll go away. And it does generally go away, which is my third and last point. Media companies are unwilling or unable to spend the money to fight the fight. And I have had this discussion so many times with my bosses that I can't do it anymore because it makes me sick to my stomach. We have to mount legal challenge. When institutions refuse to give us information, we have to hire lawyers. And we have to go to court and we have to force them to do it because 9 times out of 10, we will win. But companies are not willing to spend the money to get the answers from government. And that's a big problem. It's inexcusable, and it's one reason that I'm so frustrated with my job.
Oftentimes those
You might
companies,
think about getting Mike and Gary to do this for you.
No, yeah, that's
There you go.
that's the embarrassment is that Comcast is a multi-billion-dollar company. I'll tell you right now, and I've said this kind of stuff publicly throughout my career. So right now, the Senate passed a law that makes public police discipline files. It's a very big deal in California. The police unions, as they would or should, are challenging it because they represent officers who don't want this stuff public. So the media hires lawyers. Here in San Diego, we hire this attorney from a reputable firm, and the media companies here, 20 years ago, there would be a line of companies, including my own, to pay the full freight at the hourly rate and to challenge it. Now, these companies won't pay $1,000 each, which isn't even enough for the lawyer, much less Comcast, which, like I repeat to say, makes $1 billion, has revenues in the billions, profit in the hundreds of millions, will not stand behind a really important local issue and pay for the lawyer.
Do you guys, when someone doesn't cooperate with you, what do? Do you report that they were not available?
No, that's a very good point. And Rory has been through this. Our policy, right, is call them out.
I call them out.
Okay, so in your story you'll say.
Sometimes I call them out and they'll say that's a little harsh. So, but like for example, I did Sweetwater last week, and they have not talked to us about a $30 million deficit. They said, well, we're talking at the board meetings. It's not the same. We don't get to talk to you and ask the questions. We didn't just go up and say, this is what they said at the board. That's the end of the story. So they almost don't understand that. So finally, the superintendent spoke. She read from a statement about the budget. First time we've heard from her since October, when this whole thing has happened. She read from a statement, and then we're going to open it up to questions. Oh, but we're not going to answer them on camera. So I called her out on it. I called her out on the thing. We haven't heard from her. We were very happy to hear from her today. This is the first time she's spoken to the media and answered questions. However, she wouldn't do them on camera. Absolutely, I am starting to, because I have had a lot of pushback.
What's the reluctance on the part of the boss? Why would they?
Oh, they just didn't want me to say what I originally. No, my boss is totally behind me.
Okay.
Totally.
So
Call them out. Just, because I get crazy in the newsroom, Marty.
don't
I
let
get crazy in the newsroom, and sort of like, shh, just don't even. Just call them out. Just call them out, because I'm so frustrated by their lack of transparency.
Yeah, but the problem is they don't care.
Right.
Because
That's exactly right.
you're one television station and the viewership is like this. There were 10s, right, and 12s when I first started in the 80s, and now it's like a half of a point. So what do they care? There's 1,100 people watching that, and maybe some percentage of that reading it. So really what it might take would be some group effort. I don't know. I mean, because you can't sue about that. You know, that's just, yeah.
Councilor Warburg.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Recently, Ben Guaso tried to file a bill, which I think was rescinded, but about charging for access to, I guess it was freedom of information. And I think it's been pulled back.
Yeah.
But when I was reading it or listening to it, it was like, how is that possible that anyone would think that was okay to be able? And I know he said, well, it's an administrative thing, but it seemed like such a slap to slap down any information that one is trying to get. And I was just wondering if it was as impactful as you.
Well, I didn't
as it
follow,
felt to me.
that's the Waso-Mara Elliott
Right.
bill
Yeah.
regarding public records request. I didn't follow it all that closely, but it wasn't about charging, it was about compelling the requester to what's called meet and confer
Correct.
with the agency before filing a lawsuit.
I thought
So-
there was money involved also. It wasn't.
No, it might involve attorney's fees, but the issue was that the media felt that it would, and not just the media, but all public advocates like Mike, and you know, we're not the only ones that asked for public records. In fact, probably we're in the minority. Felt it was a hurdle to the process of getting the information, and I would say that that's a really high point. Look at how that process worked.
NBC really put, Voice of San Diego started it.
Yeah.
And then
And
the
the Union
NBC
Tribune?
featured it as a big piece.
Yeah. And the Union
I think that
Tribune?
scared the elected officials,
Yeah.
scared the mayor.
Yeah.
And because what they were proposing as the meet and confer was you had to show that you had met and conferred on every single issue, which
Right.
meant you could take the 24 days they could already stall and stall it all out for months.
Which they do anyway.
Yeah, I think that was a really heartening example of what goes, and here locally, like Mike says, you know, we did a story, the Voice of San Diego did a lot of stuff. The Union Tribune wrote a big editorial, Matt Hall, right, at the paper,
Right,
who's
Matthew Hall.
he's doing a great job. He's really committed to First Amendment stuff.
Another
And
daily
then the mayor
transcript.
came out, the mayor came out against it, and a couple of council members came out against it, and Waso and Elliott dropped it. So that's a great, you know.
Gino?
No, just
can
for-
I ask Gene a question?
I'll come back to
Oh,
those two. Go ahead.
Well,
I
I want to preface this by saying that when I started in government in 1966 with Brown, every major television station in the state had a full-time political reporter in Sacramento. Full-time. Now, I don't know if there's one. And I lobbied for a long time. This guy had this wonderful half-hour show. And he was the political editor who came. And he was the only one. And would you just share with us, when you look back, who was the most compelling person locally, politically, that you covered, and maybe other similar aspects of that?
There were a lot of them. That was the idea of the boss. I say, you know, we decided that we were going to put on a show, which still runs. It's been inherited by a guy who came west from Al Sharpton's MSNBC show. And it was called, I decided to name it Politically Speaking, and for 9 years, that's what we did. And to tell you the truth, there just wasn't enough time, airtime, to get too deeply into that stuff, but we did a number of great shows, and it continues to this day, as a matter of fact, and I think it's going to continue. Hold that thought. Peggy, you had a question, then I'm going to...
It was more of a comment.
Yes.
Yeah, so, and this is going to go two ways, one to our veterans and one to the new students. So I think that in the land and the time we're in of branding and social media branding, I think the school districts know this. I think everyone knows it, obviously. Our president knows this. We know how to use social media to brand. This is the way, this is the platform that information is getting out on. As you mentioned, New York Times is doing a spectacular job of this. Wall Street Journal, who called out the college scandal by naming everyone, not just the celebrities who were engaged in that. So my question is there room or is there direction to start shaping the future of journalism by having veteran journalists who know the core and the solid foundation work with new journalists, because you guys are the future of journalism online. You know, fighting the fake news, but in a world of Instagram and filters and a world of but I'm just saying more, everything's branding, right? Right? You've got the Kardashians, you've got whoever, Instagram influencers. So could you use influencers to pressure school districts to talk? Could you use young influencers on social media, where you guys are key at, to take journalism that next step with the backing of veteran journalists who maybe know the ins and outs, so you wouldn't get sort of trapped in their snares?
And use the attorneys that we know, and also don't just let them hide behind statements. We're gonna craft a statement here, and that's all we have to say. And then what is most important, or very important, just getting them to talk to you, is allow the follow-up questions. Wait a minute. That confuses me here. Wait a minute. Because you've got to have a dialogue. You can't just say, "Oh, okay, so this is how you're going to make us go away." No. I've got a follow-up question and a follow-up question. That's the whole thing. That's what
Do you think that would work by working with the new journalists in a different platform? So you're not going to do it on TV, you're not going to do it on camera anymore, but you're going to have a social influencer who has 2 million followers, which is more than any TV station here at night is going to watch, be able to hammer them and maybe put the question out there without an answer. Hey, so-and-so, we're asking you this. 5 influencers on social media are asking you to answer this. Go to your local TV station, go to your radio. Do you guys both see that as something that might work? Okay, yay, hired, let's do it.
Can I jump in on that, Rory? I think I can try and answer that question to a degree. I don't know if an influencer should do something like that, because they're out there marketing and selling.
True.
So that's the opposite of what we do as journalists. Yeah. But I think to your point, there's always been this talk of convergence in media. We're doing MMJing, which is your writing, editing, doing all this stuff, one person doing all the one thing. I think in this day and age, what you're seeing is true convergence happening where, and you're talking about building a brand as well too. You've got somebody who is maybe a newspaper reporter who's also showcasing themselves on CNN, MSNBC, or Fox, and they're also doing stuff online as well too, and they may be in front of the camera as a reporter as well. So they're doing all types of different things, and I think that sometimes people of this generation are picking up on somebody that they really do like, and they're following that person who's doing multiple different things, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's in front of the camera, whether they've got a huge presence on Instagram. I don't know how much news people are getting from Instagram, but it is a possibility. You've got, speaking of influencers, also maybe, not Rosie O'Donnell, but she's dating Cory Booker now. I'm sorry, it's but anyway, Rosario Dawson,
Yeah.
Thank you. Rosario Dawson you've got a lot of actors and actresses that are heavily into politics these days now, and so, I mean, to your point, those are influencers who are kind of influencing the political landscape and whatnot, and so it's slowly happening, but you can't have somebody who is, you can't have somebody who's an influencer being a journalist. You just have to have those journalists who are focused and don't have those outside interests, doing those multiple platforms, and people just have to pick up on them and follow them, and maybe.
Or maybe the journalist could interview the influencers who are hot on the school district. I'm trying to figure out a way to get around the branding of all of they know, as you said, they know. They don't have to say squat. Nobody's going to care. Like, how do you get that value back, and you need the momentum of somebody else?
You have to have a community that cares though also.
Right.
You have to have viewers in a community
Like
that
what
care.
kind of sponsors, that's
I have a good example of that. We broke this big story. It's like the biggest story we've ever had in my entire career. Like a week ago, it's about the Border Patrol stopping journalists and attorneys and supposedly keeping secret dossiers. I don't think that was exactly accurate. Anyway, so this actress Alyssa Milano, She has 3 million followers, and she retweeted our story. And that is an example of, that story spread, so far because people who aren't journalists and took an interest in it helped spread it. Gene, what do you think?
No, they took a look at it, and it just continued to multiply, to magnify.
You've been patient.
You had a couple points that I want to emphasize on. And first, for this group, I'm not sure that I agree with telling potential journalists and future journalists that there's not a career.
We said there's not money.
It's not for the money. Our oldest son, we thought would be like, MT engineer, brilliant mind, couldn't keep his shoelaces tight, insisted on going into journalism, now works for NBC station in Washington, D.C. I've got 2 peacocks in the family now. He loves it. It's his drive that got him there. It's his work ethic that got him there. And Paul, you brought up that point with this recent piece. When I worked at KFMB and KSDO, we went through this era where everything was, oh, we can't sell that, we can't get a sponsor for that, you're not going to do it. We need this number of stories cranked out each day. It was about quantity rather than quality. I was always felt really, really fortunate when I had time to enterprise something and work on a story. Tell a story. Do something effective. Whether it was hard, it was, gut-wrenching, a positive thing. I feel like there's more of a turn now in the industry to enterprising again, to having a little bit more time to tell stories, and it takes that drive. Where NBC, I think, has been a standout doing Inspiring San Diego. I mean, some of these pieces that maybe and they can be sold, they can be sponsored, as it were. But those things are just, that's going back to true journalism again. And I think we're kind of on a swing shift again where you guys are going to be the next Gene Cubbisons, but it's going to take that work ethic, it's going to take that drive, it's going to take building, confidences and trust and relationships with people that you work with. I mean, Rory, I was a journalist in this market for many, many years, and then on the other side as a PIO. So that was interesting for me to take that, taking my journalism career, starting in one thing. I've reinvented my career over time, and that journalism background has always been really essential to my personal reward in what I do. And Rory and I got into some arguments over times where, you're not going on camera. It's like, I'm not even at the building, Rory, I can't do it.
But you're out there talking to me, which makes the difference.
And I gotta say, I'm frustrated with that district now at the slamming door. I think when I was there, I tried really hard to not have journalists having to resort to a PRA to get information.
Can you name that district?
Pardon?
Can you name that district now?
San Diego Unified School District.
Just calling them out.
Claire, I'm not saying that there's not a career there, because if it's in your blood, it's in your blood. If it's in your blood.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that financially it's not, unless you go
Even
left.
if it's not a long-term career, it affords you other opportunities.
This student has a question over here.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Well, Rory, you were talking about how, that there are certain networks like CNN leans more toward liberal ideas, and that Fox leans
Progressive.
more towards, progressive, and Fox is more towards conservative. Do you think that the future of journalism, that this is a good thing, that there's this opinion that is going along with fact, or do you think that a process of objectivity is necessary in the future of journalism?
I think that as long as you know what you're watching, it's okay. But the problem with that is that people don't realize they're watching an opinion show. They're watching Chris Matthews, Hardball. A commentator. They don't understand. They're watching Sean Hannity. They don't understand. They just think that's the news. That is not the news. And as long as you know, even on social media, that you know what you're reading, you might be reading this part of the story. And I feel like some of that's gotten sort of all jumbled up. So, no, I don't think we can only have that. I think it's okay to have that. In fact, I switch. I want to see how Fox is spinning this. I want to see how MSNBC is spinning this. I think it's really good to have a lot of input, but you have to know what you're watching.
It's the responsibility of the consumer.
Absolutely.
Gee, do you remember when they used to write those articles in San Diego Magazine about who runs or who owns or who controls San Diego, and who was our beautiful journalist on Channel 8? What was it?
No, Harold Keene.
No, Harold Keene. Harold Keene, okay. Talk to us about that, Gene, if you will.
Wow, he was quite a journalist. There's no doubt about that. He could do television, not only as KFNB Channel 8. That was my first TV station. He wrote for San Diego Magazine. He wrote for all kinds of print, and that was truth for its own sake. I really liked there. And then Harold Keenes were pretty rare.
Yeah. But I mean, why do we not have some publication now that just says, who runs San Diego today? I mean, more is it.
Well, I'm sorry, I haven't kicked enough you-know-what to make that happen. But you're correct. You're correct. That kind of thing is
I think the Voice of San Diego is
VOSD.
kind of, the Reader did it for a while. We did
right.
a lot of really good stuff at the Reader. And I think the Voice of San Diego is probably the closest thing we have to a publication that's really calls out people, isn't scared of the quote-unquote power structure. I mean, I think, one thing, I think the level of critical coverage is pretty poor in this town. How we could have a mayor who's as ineffectual as Kevin Faulkner for this long and not have him really called out on a regular basis is beyond me. I heard something, Mike, you would know this better than that I think Lorena Gonzalez said it just a couple of days ago when she used some sort of profanity to describe somebody, and she said, the thing about San Diego is in public everybody's really polite to one another, and behind closed doors they'll cut your neck off, but I think that's true, and I think this unwillingness to call people out or have a tough conversation or something is really detrimental to our city.
I've never been in favor of doing that.
Yes, we have the editor of the school paper who has a question.
And so kind of like what you guys have been saying.
This is Dana.
Hi everyone, I'm Dana. Hi. So kind of what you guys have been saying, like as a young journalist, I just couldn't imagine doing anything else. Like you were saying, like
it was in my blood too.
It's just you can't not, right? Like there's nothing else that could ever be as fulfilling as this. So how do you think people that will, no matter what, will not be persuaded otherwise, how do we go about solving these solutions? Do you think that it's a phase that people have a lack of willingness to share information? Or do you think it's something that can be mended? Or do you think we're going to have to get more crafty maybe with how we get information?
The answers are yes, yes, and yes.
Great, done.
You've answered your own yes. And the instinct, you're right. It's something that starts with the heart, and then it goes up here, and then you begin to figure out, what do I need to do to get this? How can I put aside the other things that A, make me money, or B, take me to this part of the world, or C, whatever. It's something that you're going to do if that is what you have been sort of brought up to want to do, or just have an idea of what to do. And let me just finish with the Harold Keene thought. He was such a legend in this town. No kidding, he wrote for San Diego Magazine. I just can't say enough about him. As a matter of fact, one day when we were out shooting a story in one of the cemeteries, someone had told me where this was anyway, and I went to visit his gravesite. I went to visit his gravesite. The one out in sort of East San Diego. What's
Mount Hope.
Mount Hope, yeah.
Or Greenwood or Mount Hope.
Greenwood.
Yeah.
And
Greenwood.
what was that like for you?
Wow. I've seen the legend. Of course, 6 feet under.
But he was so big.
Oh, gosh.
He was such a big player. And Channel 8 had a reputation of being a little bit more conservative, let's say. But he was such a big player that no one would challenge him, right? I mean, that's right.
Correct. And when I got to Channel 8, I was told, stay away from Harold Keene. He's got the own things that he likes to do on his own, and sometimes you're not going to be able to handle that. And so I minded my own business, and Harold would come down the hall, and he'd kind of pull me aside. We'd walk down the hall, and he'd say, how would you like something on another near miss between two airlines? This was after PSA 182 and the small aircraft there. And he served me up, I've got to say, at least a handful of stories, because they were just, just coming out of his heart. And he had been told, stay away from my current guys. There's a new news director. And I got these stories, and since was thought of as the person that brought them forth. Oh yeah, we want that. When can we get that on the air? Who can we call in? Harold, who do we call in? How do we handle this? Okay. But
Harold Keene was also a stringer for the New York Times.
correct.
And Dean Nelson has done a lot of writing for the New York Times.
Yes.
I have just one personal thing about Harold Keene. I was the national spokesman for an anti-war Vietnam War effort. And part of my job was I'd go to different cities, meet with editorial boards, television shows, radio talk shows. I came here and was interviewed by Harold Keene. That night, I went to the San Diego Padres game at Westgate Park, Pacific Coast League with my brother Bill, probably.
That was in the
And as I
early
was
60s.
walking down to our seats, I became aware of the fact that it seemed like virtually everyone was, they were saying, oh, I saw him on Harold Keene. I mean, he had he was a
Following,
huge
yeah.
influence, as you said.
And he had this kind of old cranky voice, and he would never just let a question, an answer to a question, just rest there. There'd be a follow-up question and a follow-up question until, Harold, that's all the time I have right now. Isn't that enough for your story?
Has a question.
We look forward to the future and do a little forecasting on our mayor's race in 2020.
I think Corey Briggs is going to be such an interesting aspect to that race. So it's Barbara Bree and Todd Gloria and Corey Briggs. I think those are three really great candidates, and I think that we're going to have a really good discussion about the future of the city, and I think it's a really good thing. Especially, I would be concerned if it was just Barbara and Todd, because I think they're like very similar, and they're both extremely competent, but they're sort of part of the establishment, you know. And I think Corey Briggs is really going to shake stuff up.
Right.
And I think with this, this neighborhood planning, you know, this let's not put parking.
Near high rise.
The issue is not what's interesting. What's interesting is there's a huge revolt among people who live in neighborhoods know it won't work. And I think that it'll be really interesting to see, because those are Corey Briggs's people. You know, what do you think, Gene?
No, that's true.
The race.
You have called it just right. Of course, Corey, there's been some abrasive relations between him and some of the community, but he is a guy that if you keep your eye on him, you look at Barbara and you look at Todd, you go, who's going to carry the flag here? Who's going to actually be something?
You see no chance of a Republican?
I think if Mark Kersey runs, he might have a shot. He's the only popular.
Okay.
I mean, really, isn't that the big story? Is that there's no viable Republican anymore? That Kevin's demise or departure will be a...
Correct. In how many election cycles? You're right.
I mean, I think the first really. I mean, Maureen, but you know that was she was kind of a hybrid.
Yeah, it's been a huge, what do they say, like a watershed, you know, in terms of registration percentage for Democrats, and even on the Board of Supervisors now, right? They're talking about the Cox seat going to a Democrat. You know, this city and county have really changed politically, and I think that is a monumental. I mean, it used to be the other way, right? Is there a Democrat? Where's the Democrat? You know.
I forgot. No, I want to go back to this. I'm a lazy lay person. So when it was really affirming to me when Paul said the New York Times and the Washington Post calls it as good journalists, I need to hear that. I subscribe to the New York Times, but I need to hear it. You know, I was sort of shocked when Mike called out to the CNN because.
Hold on, Mike. Hold on. You can't just slip out the door.
Because I have a hard time seeing them. You know, they don't seem impartial to me. I think that Gene would say that CNN knows how to hammer. They know how to get at the news. I turn on CNN and I think, well, they're not impartial anymore. as a layperson now, this is
No.
just me as a layperson, I almost need you people to rate these news agencies and say, the Washington Post is a true journalist, the New York Times is a true journalist, and now I will think more clearly about CNN because it seems like you're saying they're true journalists when I turn them on and I think, well, you're just a much more talking head scraping
Yes,
at each other.
yeah.
So I don't know, as a lazy layman, I don't know how to find my news sources. You said, well, you've got to know what you're watching.
Yeah.
You've got to know if this is a commentary or if this is a true
Who's-
news show.
what's his name,
I'm
John?
too dumb to know that.
No, your point,
It
you're
depends on
correct.
who the, like,
Yeah, but
I
you're,
watch Fox News for patience.
I watch it.
I mean, I do.
I watch it for just
But
a
there's
year.
but there's a big difference. CNN, they do have they voice their opinions, but they are, I believe, accurate in what they say. They may be giving you your opinion, but I think that they report things accurately. And there are a few people on Fox, but for the most part, Fox is 100% propaganda. 100% distortion. I mean, you turn on Fox News and they're covering the border and the crazy caravan coming up as if it's an invasion. Okay, that is manipulating the public, and that's, I mean, this is no different than fascism. I mean, it's just, this is how fascism got implanted in Germany. So I think CNN and its people recognize how serious the threat is. Now, I could be totally wrong, but that's my perspective, you know.
Yeah.
But especially now, when you have Trump saying he's not going to go peacefully if he's voted out. And that is very concerning to me, because these things sometimes can happen
Metastasize.
and the next thing you know, it's not a democracy.
Gene, before we get out of here, reflecting on your career, can you give us some of the highlights that pop up in your mind on the way over here today, or an exclusive that you broke, or some, just for the benefit of everybody here?
Yeah, I've been asked this question. It's kind of come down to, and it solidifies with this. I have been fortunate over the years to interview 3 presidents, 2 Bushes, actually one, he was not sworn in yet, but he was here in San Diego, and twice the younger one. I interviewed him at the county fairgrounds first, and then the convention center next. His dad I had interviewed at the Republican convention, River Oaks Resort Hotel in Houston, and then Bill Clinton by satellite. I'm trying to recall, I think he was in Washington at the time, but maybe he wasn't. But they were both fascinating, or all 3 fascinating people. But it's kind of odd. The person I liked talking to most and actually had the most of the time to speak with was, and let me just back up just a minute, President Bush, the older one. I had some time with him, and he was very telling me this and that, but I wasn't really amazed or impressed or anything like that. Oh, thank you, sir. I was the 7th local TV news reporter to get to interview him because my deadline was the farthest west, and this was before he had to speak to the convention or other things he had to do. And finally, the question that broke it open was, sir, you were a naval aviator, 20 years old at the time, in World War II, and his eyebrows shut up, and he thought, oh, is this some kind of trick question? What's your take on the groping that's going on with the pilots in the Navy and the Air Force, with the women that are now joining those Air Corps?
Right?
The tail hook, yeah. And his eyes just went like this, and he was outraged. You could just tell. And he could hardly begin to speak for how outraged he was. And he was saying these people ought to be brought up on court-martial. I don't know where this comes from, but it ought to stop. And I hope that this is seeping down through the ranks to get them to stop, because this is going to chase women enlisting, or at least getting into those careers. And I know this happens all the time in the military. Hold on just one, I'll come back to you. And so I'm tired of that. I found that his son was we had an easier time talking. I think this was, both places I interviewed him. And he was just fun to interview. For some reason, he had a much more of an accent. And what I recall about him is that while he was being made up and brushed and things like that, this was by someone, he was under the care, I say the care, of Ari Fleischer, his press secretary. and I was saying, have you read the most recent, I think it was the most recent, Esquire magazine about, and the cover story was how many people that went to Harvard Law and graduated in whatever year it was have actually dropped out and gotten into business or this or that or the other. They're no longer practicing law or on the bench. I said, really? I said, yeah, and I forgot what the percentage was then, but it was, it kind of raised my eyebrows. And he turned around and looked at Ari and said, see if you can get me that magazine. And I just thought, now there's a guy with real,
Curiosity.
Yeah, exactly. And so those went well. And so the questions that I got in best with them, when I would call back to the desk, they'd say, yeah, go with that one, because they had a list of questions that I should be asking. And basically the questions that I got the best answers to were, yeah, ask him about that. So those things remain in my memory. But there's a couple of, there's another, the Pursuit to Montserrat. Does the name, Jerry Dominelli, J. David and Company, ring a bell with you?
Oh,
But
really? Do we have to?
yeah, I recall there was some connection here, but at any rate. Jerry took off with some $80 million, or at least that was the figure that was cited as the amount that was defrauded or embezzled. They call it a Ponzi scheme, which essentially is the original investors get the money first, and then everybody that piles in later with their investments, where's all the money? At any rate, he took a crowd of about 4, maybe 5 of his colleagues with him to the small Caribbean island of Montserrat. Does that ring a bell, Montserrat? And this was years before a volcano just blew it in half, or at least cleaved it in half. And so we decided that we're going to chase him because we had a good leg up on the story. Channel 10 went first, came back with an interview with him. And they told me, no, you're going to stay with him until he gets arrested and all these people, and they're brought back to Miami to be arraigned. And so we did, and we caught up with him, and he gave me that garbage interview. But I found out that we were just going to be chasing him around the island for about a week. True story, until eventually the Montserrat police, and I witnessed this, and so did my cameraman, up on a balcony on the hotel that we were staying, of them being arrested. Finally, if it wasn't Montserrat police, and I believe it was because they had firearms, and they took them off that very next day, took them to Miami. I called my producer there, who was waiting for tapes. That is, back in the videotape days, we would pay somebody $20 to take one over to Miami. She would pay $20 to get whatever they brought back. And they went up on the network, and it was a great story. And so we jumped on a plane the next morning and came to Miami. I caught up with my cousin, whose name is Chris Cubbison. He's a year younger than me. And we all went to dinner at, what's that crab? Joe's Stone Crab. Oh, yeah. Did we run up the bill? Yeah, I told my boss I was going to do that. We were going to put a few $100s on the expense account. But at any rate, I recall them being arraigned in Miami federal court. I remember one of the guys leaned over, and his girlfriend, later to become wife, or she was his fiance at the time, and he put his arm around her shoulder, and one of the bailiff marshals came over, knocked that away, gave him a hard look. No, we don't do public displays of affection here. And eventually, Jerry did get 10 years in a medium security prison up in Central California. And one day, 10 years later, I and a photographer went up to do a story on our California medium security prisons. Are they essentially country clubs because they had pools and workout and all that. And toward the back of the facility, at least where
The library.
the library, and I saw, that's Jerry Dominelli. Look, it's the librarian.
I was with you.
Oh, was that you? Yeah, Paul and other, yeah. I forgot, I'm sorry, you, yeah. And we went over, and hi, Jerry, Gene Cubbison, NBC7. He hardly looked up, shaking, like this, and I said, wow, you're getting pretty close to parole, I guess, or something like that. What's that?
I said, oh, cheekers. Go ahead.
And he just kind of nodded. He really didn't.
He'd had a stroke.
Was that it? Yeah, he'd had a stroke. And I said, when you get to the day of being released, yeah, exactly, or parole, I'd be delighted if I could call you, or if you could give me some number where I could catch up with you, and we could do an interview after all these years. What has it been like to be in U.S. Marshals, or at least the prison custody? He gave me a non-answer. But at any rate, I learned that when he got out, he went to his brother's place in Chicago. But I was just astounded to see, whoa, what a small
world.
Small world. One more story.
Yes.
One more story that rings a bell. Okay, is this the time you normally dismiss?
No, it's for fun.
Okay. I think what I am reminded most by, or at least the most exciting thing that has happened, has been the bus hijacking.
Oh, yeah.
Does that yeah, it's the bus hijacking by a tweaker, essentially. You'll know what that means, a guy on heavy drugs, and he kicked all the people out, and he took it on a round and round chase, roughly 67 miles throughout the city. I was just finishing a live shot at the stadium, which involved essentially the reconstruction to rehabilitate, or at least renovate the stadium to add 10,000 seats so it could host Super Bowls, which it did some years later. And I was just finishing up, and they said, "Hey, have you heard about this bus jacking chase?" I said, "No." They said, "Get onto it. It's right now on Interstate 5, going up Interstate 5. I said, "Okay." Got in with Jerry Kaplan. Away we went. Chased him up to about Mission Bay. It turned around and came back to, where was the neighborhood?
Del Cerro-ish.
Del Cerro-ish, yeah.
Barry Soper's apartments.
Right, and he began essentially rotating around one particular blocks. This was a live shot, a live truck, and they said, "Get out and set up a live shot there. We want to see that thing going by. See if you can stop him," and get an interview. So we get out, and I see it go by 2 times. There was already a chopper up, a chopper piloted by Bob Turr. Does that name ring a bell? Katie Turr? Does that name ring a bell? Katie Turr's father. Down from Los Angeles. They had brought him down because we didn't have a chopper locally that was available, so they essentially sent him down. He circled above, and at one point, the bus got closer and closer, and it started leaning toward me, and I could see two to three wheels that were flattened by the spike strips that they put out. And I said, Jerry, it's coming this way. And there was a crowd outside just yelling, "Yeah, sure, come on, man, come on, bus guy, bus boy." I said, "Get out of the way, be careful here." And sure enough, it rumbled to a stop right in front of me. The door opened, and the guy came down the stairs and went spread eagle on the ground in front of me. And I looked down, I said, I was looking for a knife. No knife here. Had a microphone still in my hand. There was another camera on the street, another knife on, and I said something along the lines of, "Sir, what's going on here?" And he babbled something. I couldn't make it out. We actually hired somebody to listen to the audio tape, and he was saying, "I've killed some cats up the street. I've killed some cats." Well, those were the spike strips. But at any rate, as I was going to ask another question, I saw over my eye the posse of police getting out, all the cars showing up, and they disgorged from the cars, and I stepped back just in time like a matador for them to pile on top of me and eventually get him down and chokehold himself. And I then noticed behind him was coming one of the cop cars, nobody in it, but a dog jumping from the back seat to the front seat. The guy had left it in neutral, and it was coming, and it was down a slight slope, and fortunately it hit the guy's feet that were up like this. He was face down, but the 2 tires went just like this to keep him to smashing into that whole dog pile of police. And I just stepped back there and I went, "Whoa." Well, the network said later, "Hey, I heard that that pile got run over." So indifferent. Didn't the dog push the car into drive? No, because we were able to see the audio, the aerial shot, and the dog jumped in after the car had stopped and caught the guy's heels. But at any rate, I thought, okay, we're done. They took him away, and I said, "Okay, well that's it." This was a Friday night. I recall very well. They said, "Okay, come on in and bottle up the story for 11. I said, "Me? Got to come in and do the 11 too?" That would have been my 4th show of the day. I said, "Oh yeah, and by the way, you're going to come in tomorrow morning and do the Today Show their hours, and because they want to interview you on set. I said, okay, this is what the price of heroism.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, this has been fun,
Yes.
but it's also been instructive. Thomas Jefferson said that if he had to make a choice between government and newspapers, or newspapers without government, he would not hesitate to choose the latter. There was a great jurist by the name of Werner Kahn, should have been on the Supreme Court, but wasn't. And one of the most famous speeches ever given in this country, at the conclusion of World War II in Central Park, maybe 1 million, maybe 1.5 million came to hear the jurist. He gave a speech on the spirit of liberty. It's worth looking up, and it's easy to do. But he said that the spirit of liberty is that spirit which is not too sure it is right. And I think that whatever we're doing, as well as with journalists, a good thing to keep in mind. This has been special. These individuals I've known a very long time. I'm enormously fond of them. They have served the public interest with integrity and with great levels of skills. That includes you, Marty. And we owe them that debt. And I would hope to the journalism students, to you, from San Clemente, a freshman, that you'll be inspired. There are other ways to get the story out. Thank you all for coming. I wish you a great rest of Saturday.
Just one footnote. I go back to 1973 was the first time I met George. He was coming west from Washington after many years, and he bothered to see my byline. I think it was important that he called me and took me to lunch. And I remember him telling me, I believe it was on that occasion before you took me to lunch with Roger Hedgecock later on, who later became mayor, and that's another story. But hearing that he was going to create just such an entity as this, the City Club of San Diego. And he told me what was going on in Washington, how his group there started with a small, but it wasn't anything like it's grown to here in the city of San Diego. So it has been, how many years now? Some
44.
44 years, and it's been a pleasure, sir.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.